She changed the locks to teach me about responsibility, but I learned something completely different instead. The lesson just wasn't the one she intended to deliver. I'd been married to Brooke for 3 years, living in our 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet suburban Dallas complex called Meadowbrook Commons, where neighbors actually knew each other's names and kids still rode bikes in the courtyards. I worked as a telecommunications tower maintenance specialist, spending my days climbing 100-foot structures to keep the city connected during everything from routine maintenance to emergency repairs, while Brooke managed social media accounts for local businesses from our converted spare bedroom office. That particular Tuesday had been especially brutal, starting with a pre-dawn emergency call to replace damaged equipment on a cell tower in Arlington after Monday night storms, followed by 2 routine inspections in Plano and ending with troubleshooting connectivity issues at a facility in Garland that kept half the county's emergency services offline for 3 hours. I pulled into our designated parking spot after the 12-hour shift, my muscles aching from the climbs and my mind already focused on the cold Shiner Bock waiting in our refrigerator and maybe catching the Rangers game highlights. I grabbed my equipment bag and climbed the exterior stairs to our second-floor apartment, automatically reaching for the electronic lock pad we'd installed the previous year after Brooke convinced me that smart home technology was essential for modern living. I pressed my thumb to the sensor, the same routine I'd performed countless times, but instead of the familiar green light and welcoming beep, a red light blinked at me mockingly, followed by an error tone that meant my access had been completely revoked. I tried again, thinking maybe the sensor was dirty from my work gloves or the equipment grease that never quite washed off completely, but the result was identical. I knocked on our door, confusion mixing with exhaustion as I waited for Brooke to answer, but instead heard her voice crackling through the security intercom speaker mounted beside the doorframe, crisp and deliberate like she'd been rehearsing this moment. She informed me that I was locked out because I'd forgotten to pick up her dry cleaning from the shop on Mockingbird Lane, something she'd asked me to do during my lunch break, and that this was a teaching moment about priorities and consideration for my wife's needs in our marriage. I stood there in my work clothes, safety harness still clipped to my belt and steel-toed boots dusty from tower platforms, listening to her explain through the tinny speaker how I needed to learn that marriage meant thinking about someone other than myself and that actions had consequences. The absurdity of the situation hit me like a dropped wrench as I realized she was literally holding me hostage outside our own home because I'd forgotten an errand during a day when I'd spent 11 hours ensuring emergency communications systems stayed operational across 3 counties, potentially saving lives with every connection I restored. I heard the gentle sound of water hitting plants on the adjacent balcony and turned to see Sage, our neighbor from Unit 2B, watering the small herb garden she maintained in terracotta pots along her railing, her long auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She was a freelance architectural photographer in her early 30s who traveled frequently for assignments documenting everything from Art Deco buildings in Miami to prairie schoolhouses in Chicago, and we'd exchanged pleasantries in the hallway enough times for me to know she was intelligent, well-traveled, and genuinely easy to talk with. Sage glanced over at me standing awkwardly by my door with my equipment bag, then at the intercom speaker where Brooke's voice continued explaining my various shortcomings as a husband, and I saw understanding dawn in her green eyes as she processed the ridiculous scene unfolding before her. She approached the shared balcony divider between our units, a decorative metal screen that provided privacy while allowing conversation, and quietly asked if I'd like to wait on her side with some iced tea while I figured out my domestic situation, gesturing toward the comfortable outdoor furniture she'd arranged in the shaded corner where climbing jasmine provided natural cooling from the intense Texas heat. I accepted Sage's invitation and climbed over the low divider between our balconies, grateful for her kindness and the prospect of sitting somewhere that didn't involve standing in the hallway like a locked-out teenager waiting for parental permission to come home. She brought out 2 glasses of perfectly sweetened tea with fresh mint from her herb garden, and we settled into her comfortable wicker chairs that overlooked the complex's central courtyard where residents often gathered in the evenings to let their kids play or walk their dogs. I found myself explaining my work to someone who actually listened with genuine interest, describing how tower climbing required both physical strength and technical knowledge, how each structure had its own personality and unique challenges, and how the view from 200 feet up gave you a completely different perspective on the sprawling metroplex below. Sage shared fascinating stories about her architectural photography career, how she'd spent the previous month documenting Mission Revival buildings in San Antonio for a coffee table book and was planning a trip to photograph Frank Lloyd Wright's lesser-known residential designs across the Southwest for a magazine feature. I realized I hadn't had such an intellectually stimulating conversation in months, possibly years, as Brooke typically dismissed my job as simple blue-collar work that didn't require real thinking and showed little interest when I tried to describe the complex technical challenges I solved daily or the satisfaction of keeping critical communications running. Through the sliding glass door, I could see Brooke moving around inside our apartment like a caged animal, periodically appearing at the window to glare out at us with increasing agitation as she watched me actually enjoying myself instead of standing outside her door begging for forgiveness and promising to be more considerate in the future. When she saw us laughing together over Sage's hilarious story about convincing a small-town Texas courthouse security guard to let her photograph the building's unique Art Deco details, Brooke's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely like ice under pressure. She stormed outside and positioned herself at the wrought iron courtyard gate directly below us, her voice echoing off the surrounding three-story buildings as she screamed that I was making a complete spectacle of myself and embarrassing her in front of the entire neighborhood with my juvenile behavior. She accused Sage of deliberately encouraging my irresponsibility and inappropriately interfering in our marriage, claiming that any decent woman with proper boundaries would have sent me home immediately instead of enabling my childish defiance by offering refreshments and entertaining conversation like some kind of relationship homewrecker. Sage remained remarkably calm throughout the verbal assault, setting down her sweating tea glass and leaning forward slightly to address Brooke with the kind of measured, professional tone you'd use with an unstable person who might become physically violent at any moment. She pointed out that locking someone out of their own home for forgetting dry cleaning seemed somewhat disproportionate to the offense, especially when that person had just worked a 12-hour shift maintaining critical infrastructure that kept emergency services operational, and that she was simply offering basic human kindness to someone who appeared to have been treated unreasonably. This perfectly reasonable observation sent Brooke into an even more furious rant about interfering outsiders who didn't understand the complexities of marriage dynamics and had no business inserting themselves into private domestic situations they couldn't possibly comprehend. Her screaming attracted immediate attention from other residents throughout the complex, including elderly Mr. Peterson from the ground floor who opened his door wearing his Vietnam veteran baseball cap to investigate the commotion, took one long look at the scene unfolding below, and commented loudly enough for everyone in the courtyard to hear that Brooke had clearly lost her damn mind over something completely trivial. Mrs. Garcia from across the courtyard appeared on her second-floor balcony with her arms crossed and her expression showing obvious disapproval as Brooke continued her increasingly unhinged tirade about respect and boundaries. Even the young couple from Unit 1C with their toddler emerged to witness what was rapidly becoming the most dramatic neighborhood event since the previous summer's infamous pool party incident involving the Homeowners Association president. I watched from the safety of Sage's comfortable balcony as my wife transformed into someone I barely recognized, her face flushed red with rage as she gestured wildly and demanded that everyone mind their own business while simultaneously making our most private marital matters as public as possible through her increasingly theatrical performance in the middle of the complex courtyard. Brooke maintained the lockout for 6 grueling hours, periodically appearing on our own balcony like some kind of deranged neighborhood watch captain to glare daggers at Sage and me, clearly expecting her punishment to break my spirit and send me crawling back with heartfelt apologies and promises to prioritize her dry cleaning above all other earthly concerns. As the afternoon Texas heat became unbearable even in the shade, with temperatures climbing toward the mid-90s and humidity making the air feel thick as soup, Sage suggested we move inside her air-conditioned apartment, and I gratefully accepted, marveling at how someone I barely knew was showing me more basic human consideration than my own wife had demonstrated in months of increasing control and criticism. Her living space was tastefully decorated with framed photographs from her architectural projects, comfortable furniture that actually invited relaxation instead of serving as expensive display pieces, and bookshelves lined with photography guides, art history volumes, and travel memoirs that spoke to a curious, educated mind constantly seeking new experiences and knowledge. She showed me her impressive portfolio of architectural photographs, each image capturing not just buildings but the stories they told about the people who designed and inhabited them. From a crumbling Art Deco movie theater in downtown Dallas that had once hosted vaudeville acts to a perfectly preserved Victorian mansion in Galveston that had survived countless hurricanes through sheer stubborn craftsmanship and community determination. As she shared detailed stories about her travels documenting historic buildings across the Southwest, from ancient adobe missions in New Mexico where Spanish colonists had built their hopes into thick walls to limestone courthouses in central Texas hill country where justice had been dispensed for over a century, I realized I hadn't had such an intellectually stimulating conversation in years. Maybe since college when ideas and experiences mattered more than social media presence and material acquisitions. Brooke typically dismissed my interests as blue-collar nonsense that didn't require real thinking, rolling her eyes dramatically when I tried to explain the complex engineering challenges of tower maintenance or the genuine satisfaction of solving technical problems that kept entire communication networks operational during natural disasters and emergencies. When Sage offered to make dinner, suggesting we cook together rather than order expensive takeout from one of the overpriced chain restaurants Brooke preferred, I accepted eagerly, discovering that she approached food preparation with the same artistic sensibility and attention to detail she brought to her photography work. We prepared a simple but delicious meal of grilled chicken seasoned with herbs from her carefully maintained balcony garden, roasted vegetables seasoned with exotic spices she'd collected from local farmers markets during her travels, and fresh sourdough bread from a neighborhood bakery she'd discovered during one of her evening walks around the area to scout potential photography subjects. Meanwhile, Brooke had escalated her surveillance operation into something resembling a military intelligence gathering mission, positioning herself at various windows and doorways throughout our apartment to document our activities with her phone camera, presumably building some kind of evidence file for whatever legal or social media campaign she was planning to justify her increasingly bizarre and controlling behavior to friends and family. When she realized we were actually cooking dinner together like civilized adults, sharing stories and laughing over simple domestic tasks, her fury reached what I thought might be dangerous new heights, and she began pounding aggressively on the shared courtyard gate while demanding that the building manager intervene immediately in what she described as a completely inappropriate situation that violated the complex's moral standards and community guidelines. Her increasingly frantic pounding attracted Mrs. Chen, the middle-aged property manager, who emerged from the front office looking thoroughly annoyed at having her peaceful evening interrupted by what appeared to be an escalating domestic dispute involving someone locked out of their own apartment by their own spouse over forgotten dry cleaning. Mrs. Chen listened with remarkable patience as Brooke explained her position about teaching responsibility and setting appropriate boundaries in marriage, then calmly pointed out that the lease agreement didn't actually give one spouse the legal right to deny the other access to their shared residence, regardless of forgotten errands or hurt feelings about household responsibilities. Sage and I enjoyed our homemade dinner on her balcony as the sun set over the Dallas skyline, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that made the whole complex look almost romantic, completely visible to anyone in the surrounding apartments including Brooke, who continued documenting everything with her phone like she was gathering evidence for some kind of federal investigation. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was having the most pleasant, relaxing evening I'd experienced in months while sitting 20 feet from my own apartment, where my wife was probably pacing around planning her next move in whatever psychological warfare campaign she'd launched over forgotten dry cleaning. The food was delicious, the conversation was engaging, and for the first time in recent memory, I felt like someone actually valued my thoughts and opinions instead of treating me like a disappointing employee who required constant correction and improvement through various punishment strategies. Our peaceful dinner was interrupted when Brooke enlisted reinforcements in the form of her sister Diana, a corporate litigation attorney who specialized in employment law and had never met a conflict she couldn't escalate into a full-scale legal battle with threats of costly litigation. Diana arrived in her black BMW wearing her power suit like armor, marching up to the complex courtyard with the confidence of someone who believed every problem could be solved through aggressive legal positioning and intimidation tactics designed to overwhelm opponents into submission. She immediately began shouting about alienation of affection laws and claiming that Sage was engaging in intentional interference with Brooke's marriage, threatening to file harassment charges and possibly pursue civil litigation for damages related to the destruction of their sacred matrimonial bond. Sage listened to this legal bombardment with the same calm composure she'd shown earlier, setting down her wine glass and politely but firmly explaining that hosting someone for dinner didn't constitute criminal activity, especially when that person had been locked out of their own home by someone who apparently believed marriage gave them dictatorial powers over their spouse's location and activities. The confrontation revealed something deeply disturbing that I'd never fully recognized before, as Diana casually mentioned that Brooke had been tracking my location through my phone for months, monitoring my work schedule through GPS data, and keeping detailed records of my movements to better manage my behavior and ensure I was meeting her expectations for proper husband performance. This revelation hit me like a physical blow as I realized the extent of surveillance and control that had been operating in my marriage, making me understand that the dry cleaning incident wasn't an isolated punishment but part of a larger pattern of manipulation and behavioral modification that I'd somehow failed to recognize while I was living it. Sage raised an eyebrow at this admission, commenting dryly that using technology to monitor and control another adult's movements sounded less like marriage and more like parole supervision, which sent Diana into a furious lecture about the legal rights of married couples to expect accountability and consideration from their spouses. The argument escalated as Diana insisted that Sage had no right to insert herself into someone else's marriage, while Sage calmly pointed out that offering basic human kindness to someone who'd been treated unreasonably wasn't inserting herself into anything but simply responding to an obvious injustice with normal decent behavior. I sat there listening to my life being dissected by lawyers and neighbors, realizing that what I'd accepted as normal marital dynamics actually looked completely insane when viewed by objective outside observers who weren't emotionally invested in maintaining the status quo. Diana's threats became increasingly elaborate and ridiculous, involving everything from restraining orders to cease and desist letters, while Sage remained unimpressed by the legal theatrics and continued to point out that adults generally had the right to choose where they spent their time, especially when their own homes had been made unavailable by controlling spouses who believed punishment was an appropriate relationship management tool. The entire confrontation was being witnessed by a growing crowd of neighbors who'd come outside to watch the entertainment, including Mrs. Garcia, who was providing running commentary in Spanish to her teenage daughter, and Mr. Peterson, who kept shaking his head and muttering about how marriage had apparently become some kind of psychological warfare in the modern era. As evening turned to night and the complex settled into its usual quiet rhythm, I found myself sleeping on Sage's comfortable couch under a soft throw blanket she'd provided, staring up at the ceiling and processing the surreal events of the day while Brooke continued her campaign by calling complex security, her parents, and apparently anyone else she could think of to create increasingly dramatic narratives about her missing husband who'd been stolen by the manipulative neighbor woman. I could hear her through the thin walls, alternating between tearful phone calls describing herself as a victim of marriage interference and angry rants about my ungrateful behavior and complete lack of respect for our sacred matrimonial vows. Morning brought an even more elaborate spectacle as Brooke had somehow managed to assemble a small crowd of enablers, including complex management representatives, her concerned parents who'd driven over from Fort Worth, and even a police officer responding to a welfare check that she'd requested by claiming I might be in danger or being held against my will by an unstable neighbor. Officer Martinez, a patient middle-aged man who'd clearly dealt with domestic disputes before, listened politely as Brooke explained her version of events, describing how Jake needed to face consequences for his thoughtlessness and learn that marriage required mutual consideration and respect for agreed-upon responsibilities. She painted herself as a reasonable wife trying to teach important life lessons to a husband who'd become complacent and inconsiderate, conveniently omitting the GPS tracking, the public humiliation, and the fact that she'd literally locked me out of my own home over forgotten dry cleaning during a 12-hour workday. The officer asked to speak with me directly, and I climbed down from Sage's balcony to join the growing crowd that had assembled in the courtyard like some kind of neighborhood tribunal examining the state of modern marriage. I calmly explained Brooke's punishment tactics, the electronic lock situation, the tracking revelation, and how I'd simply accepted an offer of basic hospitality from someone who treated me with ordinary human decency when my own wife had decided to make me homeless over a minor oversight. Officer Martinez nodded thoughtfully as I spoke, occasionally glancing at Brooke, who kept interrupting my account with corrections and clarifications about my various failings as a husband and her legitimate right to set boundaries and expectations for proper behavior within their marriage. The community witnesses began sharing their own observations from the previous evening, with Mrs. Garcia describing Brooke's screaming fit in the courtyard, Mr. Peterson commenting on the disproportionate response to such a trivial issue, and Mrs. Chen explaining how the lockout violated basic lease agreement principles about shared residence access. Brooke's parents looked increasingly uncomfortable as the full scope of their daughter's behavior became clear through multiple witness accounts, while Diana continued making legal threats that Officer Martinez politely but firmly dismissed as inappropriate for what was clearly a domestic disagreement rather than any kind of criminal activity. The officer gently explained that adults were generally free to choose where they spent their time, especially when their own homes had been made unavailable, and that no laws had been broken by either accepting or offering hospitality during a marital dispute over household responsibilities. Brooke's face grew redder with each witness statement that contradicted her victim narrative, and she began demanding that everyone stop interfering in her private marriage and return to their own business instead of ganging up on her for trying to maintain reasonable standards in her relationship. The gathering crowd included curious residents from throughout the complex who'd heard about the previous evening's drama and come to see the morning's continuation of what had become the most entertaining neighborhood soap opera anyone could remember. I stood there in yesterday's work clothes, unshaven and probably looking like I'd been through some kind of ordeal, while my wife continued explaining to law enforcement and complex management why locking me out was actually a reasonable and necessary response to my failure to prioritize her dry cleaning needs above my 12-hour shift maintaining critical telecommunications infrastructure. Brooke's sister Diana made one final desperate attempt to legally force my return, threatening Sage with harassment charges and claiming that her continued interference was causing irreparable damage to a marriage that had been perfectly stable until outside influences corrupted the natural order of their domestic arrangement. I remained on Sage's balcony, clearly visible to the gathering crowd below, as Diana cited various statutes about alienation of affection and intentional interference with marital relationships, her legal threats becoming increasingly creative and desperate as it became obvious that no actual laws had been broken by anyone except possibly Brooke herself. When Sage calmly suggested that someone who tracks their spouse's movements, locks them out of their own home, and creates public spectacles over forgotten errands might benefit from professional counseling to address what appeared to be serious control issues, Brooke's carefully maintained facade of reasonableness finally collapsed completely like a house of cards in a hurricane. She began screaming that everyone was ganging up on her, that no one understood the pressures of being married to someone who didn't appreciate everything she did to maintain their household and relationship, and that she was the real victim in a situation where her reasonable expectations had been twisted into some kind of psychological abuse narrative by interfering neighbors and biased observers. Her emotional breakdown escalated into physical action as she stormed back into our apartment and began throwing my belongings from our second-floor balcony into the courtyard below, starting with my work clothes and safety equipment, then moving on to personal items like books, electronics, and anything else she could lift and hurl over the railing. My steel-toed boots landed with heavy thuds on the concrete walkway, followed by my collection of technical manuals, then my laptop bag containing work documents and personal files that scattered across the courtyard like confetti at some demented celebration of marital destruction. The property manager, Mrs. Chin, immediately began documenting the destruction of property and public disturbance with her phone camera while explaining to Brooke that throwing items from balconies violated multiple lease provisions and community guidelines, potentially resulting in immediate eviction proceedings and liability for any damage to complex property or injury to residents. Brooke ignored these warnings completely, continuing her rampage while screaming that if I wanted to live somewhere else, I could take all my worthless possessions with me and never come back to the home she'd worked so hard to create for our marriage. The crowd below scrambled to avoid falling objects as my entire life rained down from above, creating a surreal scene that looked like some kind of performance art piece about the dissolution of modern relationships through consumer goods scattered across suburban courtyards. Diana tried desperately to stop her sister's destructive tantrum, grabbing at Brooke's arms as she prepared to launch my expensive tower-climbing safety harness into the fountain that served as the courtyard centerpiece. But Brooke shook her off and continued her systematic destruction of everything that represented our shared domestic life. Officer Martinez spoke into his radio, requesting backup and possibly mental health crisis intervention resources as the situation escalated beyond a simple domestic dispute into what appeared to be a genuine psychological breakdown involving property destruction and public endangerment through falling objects. I watched from Sage's balcony as 3 years of marriage literally fell apart in the courtyard below, my possessions scattered like the remnants of a life I'd thought was stable and secure but had apparently been built on the shifting foundation of someone else's need for absolute control and submission. Sage stood beside me, quietly asking if there was anything particularly important I wanted to retrieve from the chaos below, or if I was content to let it all go and start fresh, her tone suggesting that she understood this moment represented more than just the end of a bad day but possibly the beginning of something completely different. The neighbors who'd gathered to witness the morning's drama now found themselves dodging falling household items while watching a woman completely destroy her own marriage in the most public and dramatic way possible, creating a spectacle that would be discussed in the complex for years to come. Mrs. Chen was already on her phone with the corporate office, explaining the liability issues and lease violations while documenting every thrown item for the inevitable eviction proceedings that would follow this very public demonstration of unstable behavior and property destruction. I looked down at the assembled crowd and made a decision that surprised even me with its clarity and finality, telling everyone within earshot that I was choosing to stay where I was treated with respect and basic human decency rather than return to someone who believed that punishment, control, and public humiliation were appropriate tools for managing a marriage relationship. The words came out calmly and clearly, without anger or bitterness, just a simple statement of fact that resonated through the courtyard like a bell tolling the end of something that had probably been over for much longer than I'd been willing to admit. Brooke's final desperate move involved claiming that Sage had deliberately seduced her innocent husband, painting herself as the victim of a calculated home-wrecking campaign designed to steal her man and destroy her marriage through feminine wiles and emotional manipulation. She pointed dramatically at Sage's balcony while explaining to the crowd how this woman had taken advantage of a minor marital disagreement to insert herself into their relationship and corrupt me against my loving wife who only wanted what was best for our future together. The neighbors who had witnessed the entire sequence of events from the previous evening through the current morning's drama immediately contradicted her version of the story, with Mrs. Garcia loudly explaining how Brooke had locked me out and screamed at everyone while Sage had simply offered basic hospitality to someone who'd been treated unreasonably. Mr. Peterson added his own observations about Brooke's unhinged behavior and complete overreaction to a forgotten errand, while other residents nodded in agreement and shared their own witness accounts of the escalating control and punishment tactics they'd observed throughout the ordeal. Officer Martinez took notes as multiple neighbors provided consistent testimony about what they'd actually seen, creating an official record that completely undermined Brooke's victim narrative and established the true sequence of events for any future legal proceedings that might arise from her increasingly desperate attempts to avoid responsibility for her actions. The complex security team arrived to assess the property damage and safety hazards created by Brooke's balcony throwing tantrum, while Mrs. Chen began the paperwork process for emergency lock changes that would allow me to retrieve any remaining belongings from our apartment without further confrontation or drama. Sage quietly offered her spare bedroom until I could find my own place, explaining that she traveled frequently for work and could use someone reliable to keep an eye on her apartment and plants during her photography assignments across the Southwest region. I accepted her generous offer, realizing that Brooke's attempt to teach me a lesson about responsibility had actually taught me something far more valuable about recognizing the difference between love and control, between partnership and domination, between someone who wanted to build a life together and someone who wanted to manage another person's existence according to her own rigid specifications. The crowd began to disperse as the immediate crisis resolved itself, with neighbors returning to their own apartments but continuing to discuss the morning's events that had provided more entertainment than most reality television shows could offer. Brooke stood on our balcony looking lost and confused, as if she couldn't understand how her perfectly reasonable punishment strategy had resulted in the complete destruction of her marriage and her reputation within the community she'd have to continue living in for the foreseeable future. Diana gathered up the scattered belongings from the courtyard while trying to convince her sister to seek professional help for what were obviously serious control and anger management issues that had escalated far beyond normal marital disagreements into genuinely destructive behavior patterns. 6 months later, Sage and I announced our engagement to our supportive neighborhood community during the complex's annual barbecue celebration, where residents who had witnessed our unusual beginning wished us well and joked about how sometimes the best relationships start with the most unexpected circumstances. Brooke had moved out within a month of the incident, unable to face the daily reminder of how her need for absolute control had cost her a marriage and the respect of an entire community that had seen her true character revealed under pressure. The conversation became increasingly heated as Brooke insisted she had every right to control access to her own home, while Mrs. Chen explained that creating disturbances and harassing other residents could result in lease violations and potential eviction proceedings if the behavior continued. From Sage's kitchen window, I watched this exchange with growing amazement at how my wife's attempt to punish me for a minor oversight had spiraled into a complex-wide incident that was making her look completely unhinged to everyone who witnessed it. As evening settled over the courtyard and lights began twinkling in apartment windows, I found myself genuinely enjoying the peaceful domestic routine of preparing and sharing a meal with someone who treated me like an equal partner rather than a disappointing employee who needed constant correction and improvement.